Morning. About 20 odd years ago, I first looked at the Rio Grande as part of a study that was implemented by ISC to look at the whole geomorphic development of the Rio Grande. And over the years, we've just sort of progressed from that. What I'm going to present today is really just a sort of, in many ways, a summary of 20 odd years of doing various projects for various agencies on the Middle Rio Grande. Okay, so pretty obviously, the Rio Grande of today is not the Rio Grande of yesterday. The earliest mapping we have is 1917, Braided River. By the 1960s, we had engineered the river, basically developed a floodway in the Albuquerque Reach, somewhere around about 600 feet wide. And then by 2012, you can see a very well-established vegetated floodplain, or actually a terrace, as it turns out, sat between two levees. The big message here is Geomorphology 101. Width is a function of Q, other things being equal. More water, wider channel. Less water, smaller channel. It's a sort of an inevitable rule, and to think otherwise, I think, is sort of wishful thinking. Okay, here's just sort of an example of this. A couple of photos from MRG CD and ISC from the same location. 1933, and the sort of the tie point is the airport tower in here. You see what it looked like in the 30s before we engineered it, and what it looks like today. All right, so first of all, we channelized it. Then we put the dams in, and we affected the hydrology. The hydrology, basically, two things. Took out the flow peaks, and we raised the base flows, essentially. Which is what you do when you want to store and use water in the system. If you look at these two lower plots, Cochiti Dam went in 73. You look at the sort of annual flood peaks beforehand and after, and it's pretty obvious that Cochiti had a big impact. Over time, this just happens to be up around Peña Blanca. Just a nice set of time sequential images from 35 down to 2001. And what you see basically is the river progressively getting narrower and narrower and less complex. Now, so 2001, think, well, it can't get much narrower than it is there. Unfortunately, in the last 20 odd years, we've had a pretty dry period. And in fact, we have seen further reduction in weight. Okay, the dam did something else too. It initiated an incision of the river. Basically, from Cochiti, pretty much downstream, the river degraded. And sort of as an example of this, these are the stage rating curves at the Albuquerque gauge. And basically, you see roughly for a flow of about 1,000 CFS, about a 3-foot reduction in water surface elevation. That is a really important fact because the pre-dam floodplain is now functionally a disconnected terrace. Okay, it very rarely sees flow. So if you want a functioning river system, then something has to fit within that sort of incisive width. And that's the bars and islands. They are essentially the functional floodplain of the Rio Grande together. This is what it looks like. So this happens to be just in the Albuquerque Reach. Here is the pre-dam floodplain. This is where the cottonwood gallery forests are located. But that bank height is, close to 4 to 5 feet. And so the river, the modern river, is inset between terraces that are about that elevation. Okay, so this whole issue of bars, back in about 2004, 2005, the program funded a study that we did looking at bars and bar dynamics throughout the Middle Rio Grande. We had 10 sites from Cochiti down to San Marcial, these yellow sites through here. And the basic premise was that the form and function of the river could be described by an analysis of the bars and the change in bar forms, bank attached, mid-channel, various elevations through time. It worked out pretty well. And he provided us with some pretty information, good information about bars, both mid-channel and bank attached, that I think is certainly germane to the discussion that we're having today. Okay, so this is rule number one for a PowerPoint slide. Don't put something else right there. Okay, but I'm going to put it up because I think it's really, really important. It has important information. So, these are the sites that we looked at from Peña Blanca down to San Marcial. And you look at the change in channel width over time. You know, we're looking at changes here on the order of 1,000 feet between 35 and 2,000. Obviously, you know, we have a higher or a narrower river through time. Look at the change in bed elevation. This is mean bed elevation, okay, not Talbot elevation. And essentially, apart from down in the Bosque del Apache at San Marcial area, we have 2 to 5 feet of lowering the bed. Our peak discharge, 2-year peak discharge. These values are negatives. Essentially, we've knocked it down by somewhere around about between 2,000 and 4,000 CFS. Geomorphic rule of thumb, that roughly 2-year peak flow is a morphogenetic flow. It's an important flow. So we've knocked it down. So it's not surprising that it correlates with a reduced width. The next factor that I think is really critical is this one, which is the change in the median daily flow, Q50. And what you see is that essentially the Q50 has gone to about 900 or so CFS through the system. Interestingly enough, in many places, that's about the size of the channel. And again, from a geomorphic perspective, that makes sense. It's close to what we would call an effective discharge. Our bed material has coarsened a little bit. It depends where you're looking. In the upstream reaches, obviously below Cochiti, become pretty much a gravel bed system. That gravel transition is moving downstream towards the Albuquerque Reach. But in fact, the bulk of the Middle Rio Grande is still a sand bed system. And functionally in the sand bed system. And the last is these last two columns. I won't dwell on them, but they're the bed material load and suspended sediment load downstream of Cochiti. They've all gone down. So we've got less sediment in the system. So we've reduced the flows, sized the channel, we've got less sediment, and it's not surprising that we've got pretty severe geomorphic change. Okay, so let's look at our bar classification. Based on a lot of work in other rivers, we developed a hierarchy of bars, and essentially in the active channel, these lingoid bars, tongue-shaped bars, the fundamental unit of sediment transport within the Middle Rio Grande. These sand waves you see, and you see them, and they're spaced roughly proportionally to about the width of the channel. On top of that, we have grade bars, which are erosional features. We have alternate bars, which are attached to the bank, mid-channel bars, and bank attached bars, and various levels of these. either subaerial or subaqueous. Do they have vegetation? These are the ones we're really interested in. The level 1 and 2 mid-channel and the level 1 and 2 bank attached bars. Okay, let's look at them. So you can go out pretty much anywhere in the river with sandbed today, and you'll see the lingoid bars, level 1 braid bars, higher elevation level 2 braid bars, and a mid-channel bar. Don't get too sort of carried away with some of the vegetation on here. A lot of this is sort of annual weeds comes in and doesn't necessarily persist. So you don't have all that vegetation all the time. Our braid bars are in the active channel portion, and then we have a mid-channel bar, lower level, higher level. In terms of the bank attached bars, you sort of start at the lowest level, you've got an alternate bar, a level 1 bank attached bar, note there's sort of perennial vegetation on it, and the level 2 bank attached bar. And remember, these are inset below that historical flood point. Seen many of those. All right. Here's a factor that doesn't show up very often, and it's, in my opinion, it is critical to the whole issue. It's the monsoon, high suspended sediment, almost sort of super concentrated mud lake flows. They are generally low volume, but very high sediment concentration. And they are critical in terms of the evolution of these bars. The concentrations in here are probably close to 100,000 parts per million at times. And obviously the sources of them are the uncontrolled tributaries. Up here, Tonke, some of the other arroyos, the Albuquerque arroyos, Avo, Puerto, and then the east side tributaries down below. The right-hand picture here, it actually happens to be in San Antonio. But what you see is after a Puerto event, the entire bed of the channel, including the subaqueous part, is covered with a mud layer, highly viscous, cohesive mud layer. Now, when you think about that, it takes a hell of a lot more energy to mobilize cohesive mud than it does sand. So we're starting to form a mud armor in the system. This is what it looks like in place. Here's a mud drape. That sort of reddish color, generally at least down in the lower portion, means that it came out of our valley. The sort of blackish red or grayish mud comes out of Puerto mainly. But you see that drape of mud over, and you can see the old sand ripples on that vast surface. The net effect of this is that in the vertical sequence, that keeps that stable. If you look at this vertical sequence here now, you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4 of these mud drapes. And you see that repeatedly through these bars. The higher the bar, the more mud drapes. But the other thing that you see is that the vegetation keys in on those mud drapes. The roots come down onto it, it's perching moisture, it's holding moisture. So there's sort of a genetic relationship between the establishment of persistence of vegetation and these mud drapes. Very typically what you see, here you see the mud drape. So there was a level 1 braid bar down here. It's all sand. Draped over the top, another event. It didn't scour out, it built up over the top. All right, so you can put a sequence together. These are just stratigraphic sequences, basically. The yellow is sand, and the brown is the mud drapes. And as you go from a braid bar up to a mid-channel, level 2 mid-channel bar, you see these sequences of mud events. So those tributary mud events during the monsoon are a really important part of this biodynamic. The other thing that is really interesting is that normally, if you have a vertical bank that's composed primarily of sand, non-cohesive sands and gravels, it should be erodible. Flow should just come out and melt out. You've seen that many places. Following monsoon flows, though, what you often see is a drape. So you see that line in there? That's mud that was basically deposited up over failed materials. What it does is provide effective cohesion, the cohesion of materials. And if you look closely in here, you see all these sedges coming in. They make that lower bank down near the bottom. And so it's not just a vertical sequence, it's on the lateral side. So again, I can't stress highly enough how important these monsoon muds are to the system. All right, let's look at these sort of hydrodynamic relationships between bars and flows. For each one of these sites, we put a RAS model together. This happens to be the Central Avenue Albuquerque site. Typical, RAS output, bed profile, top of the bank through here, and then water surface profiles for a range of flows from about 300 CFS up to about 8,900 CFS, 300 up to 89. And on here, we've also got color-coded in here of the various bar types. Hard to see, so let's move to the next slide. Let me explain this. That line there is the elevation, is the top of the bank. In other words, that is the pre-dam floodplain, aka Vegetation. That's where the gallery color is. You look down here now, for each of these bar types, and we're going up in elevation, if you like, as we move this way. You look at the flow duration and the frequency of inundation. And essentially, as you would expect, these low bars, they're all the time. They're pretty much inundated a good portion of the time every year. But as you start to build vertically, then you start to see the inundation frequency or duration rather that goes down, and the flood frequency goes up. Most of these bars are located below that elevation. That one has always puzzled me. It's a real number. I thought we had a bust in the survey, but it isn't. But it just happens to be a particularly high sitting out in the middle of the channel. So if we take all of our sites, except for the site at San Antonio, where the river is deeply incised, and also down at San Marcial, and take out the Peña Blanca site as well, release gravel there. Essentially, what we see is that we can tie recurrence interval and days of inundation to these various services. And so what you see is basically that, take sort of, geomorphology 101 again. The floodplain inundation frequency is above the mean annual flood, roughly. So what do we conclude? These bars, whether they be bank attached or whether they be mid-channel, are the dynamic floodplain of the present Rio Grande. They are related to the flow regime, flow and sediment regime that exists today. Now, let's just sort of move away from that a little bit. These are the repeat cross sections at reclamation lines at Las Lunas, 2014, I think, to 2020, 3 surveys there. And you see what's happening. On the margins of a roughly 200-foot wide channel, you start to see local levees forming. That is the vegetation effect, essentially, the marginal vegetation effect. If you've got vegetation, And if you overtop that surface, you will cause deposition. So through time, you would expect this to rise. In other words, the banks to rise. And ultimately, what happens if this goes on for long enough is that the whole system rises and you purge out the cross section. The best example of those are down in the Bosque del Apache, where the channel is perched way above the flood line. And that is that dynamic interaction between flow, sediment, and vegetation. The other thing you see on these repeat cross sections is on the lower one here, is essentially how the channel has effectively narrowed by aggradation. And again, it's roughly 200 feet wide. Now, if you do a sort of very rough back of the envelope calculation, 200 by, what is it? You probably run about 1,000 CFS through that 200-foot wide channel. So what it's showing us is that the river is sizing to the range of flows that it sees most often. Now, let's just flip a little bit and talk about vegetation and flows and management. Bottom line is this. In 2005, we had a period where flows in Albuquerque exceeded 5,000 CFS for 2 months. Fortunately for ISC, we had a number of islands surveyed before the event, and we resurveyed them afterwards. And what you see as a result of that, these particular two, these warm colors here is all deposition. These were vegetated bars. The point is this, and look at the outlines. The outlines pre and post showed no erosion whatsoever. All they showed is deposition. In that 2-month period, at 5,000 CFS, which is a flow that very rarely comes down through the circuit, we saw no removal of riparian vegetation. Now, that's really not surprising when you look at shear stress. This just happens to be a cross-section in the Albuquerque site. These are the model water surface elevations, various bar types on it. But the important point here, and you can read straight across each of these for both the flow duration in the blue curve and the shear stress on the green curve. Bottom line is our shear stress is never get beyond about 0.2 PSF. 0.2 PSF will not remove vegetation. It's just not possible. So the idea that you might be able to pulse flows down and remove vegetation, forget it. It's not going to happen. We just don't have enough energy in the system to achieve that. So let's take some sort of takeaways. You take the peak flows out and you increase the base flows, then all you're really doing is irrigating vegetation. It is not surprising that a 600-foot channel has downsized to about 200 feet. Remember, basically, width is a function of Q. The bars and vegetated islands are the active dynamic floodplain, and obviously they provide habitat in the system. They're part of a dynamic continuum, and you would expect change in them. But the rate of change is a function of the elevation of the bar. The higher the bar is, the slower it changes, because it's not indicated as frequently. Once your vegetation is established, you're not going to take it out with flows. And where I go here is, it's probably worth looking, if people haven't done it, at what happened up in the Platte River, up in Nebraska. The recovery implementation program there looked very hard over a long period of time at what you could do sort of geomorphically to control vegetation. And there they want the vegetation out for looping cranes and lovers and various others. And the conclusion after 10 years of intense research was, you might be able to take out seedlings, first years for seedlings by a flow, but once that plant is established, you're not going to do it basically either by increasing flows or increasing sediment. And you're left with a choice, essentially, of mechanical intervention. If you have to get rid of vegetation, the river will not do it. The last point in here is that it's something that I think needs to be thought about carefully. A lot of what we believe about the interaction between vegetation and rivers is based on some sort of assumptions. Okay. And one of those engineering assumptions is that vegetation always causes basically reduced flows, increased stages. But there's some evidence, not here on the Rio Grande, and I suggest it might be something that we look at, that if you have highly vegetated banks, they're like walls on a sandbed channel. The reality is that your shear stresses or velocities go up in the unvegetated portion. The bed scours and you retain some capacity. Now, how do we know? If we look at the data that we have today, we have range line surveys. When do we do it? Low flows. Okay, so what do you see? You see the bed elevation either went up or it went down a little bit. You don't know what it was doing dynamically. And so our assumptions about the interaction of flows, sediment, and essentially hydraulic capacity are essentially flawed because we use a fixed bed, if you like, model. We may need to look at that because it is important. The other thing that may be very important is limit further encroachment of vegetation. If the bed scours during high flow events, we may get it scour underneath the vegetation and allow some inset. So there may be a self-regulating mechanism going on in here to maintain essentially that that dynamic width channel. So just something to think about, down the line of it. Right. With that, I think I'm done.